Hey everybody, this is Bill Muter, and in this video we're going to talk about a few basic articulations for electric bass. Now, keep in mind when we talk about articulations, we're also discussing tone quality because your articulation is your introduction to your tone. Now, for the sake of this video, on my bass, I have my volume knob turned all the way up, I have my tone knob right dead center, and I have the balance between both of my pickups. And I'm playing direct into my computer, but if I were not playing direct, if I were playing into a bass amp or a different rig, I'd want to go ahead and put all my knobs straight up and down, because my goal is I want to draw the best sound that I can out of my hands rather than the equipment. A lot of times if I'm traveling out of town for a new gig, I don't have the luxury of being able to bring my own equipment with me. I'll get there, there's a back line, I have to plug into whatever amp is there and make it sound good. So that being said, it's been very important to me to be able to draw the best sound that I can out of my hands and out of my own personal bass as I can without affecting anything with my amp. What you're also going to notice in this video is most variances in your tone quality and style can all happen with your right hand. Now, the last thing that I want to note before we get started is that the bass is relatively a new instrument. It wasn't really popular until early 1950s and beyond, where the bass started to become prevalent in modern music. Now, before that, it was upright bass or tuba. So there'll be times when you're playing electric bass in an ensemble and your goal is to sound not like an electric bass. For instance, if you're playing like an old Duke Ellington chart or bassy chart, you don't want to sound like a modern electric bass player. You want to be able to sound like an upright bass. And I'm going to give you some of those techniques to be able to sound like an upright bass, to be able to sound like a modern bass player, to get all this stuff in between with just a couple tricks. So the first thing that I want you to understand is most of your tone on the bass can be determined by the placement of your right hand. That being said, if I move my right hand further towards the neck, I'm going to get more of a bass tone, but I'm going to lose articulation. And if I move in the opposite direction, more towards the bridge, I'm going to get a lot more articulation, but I'm going to lose bass tone. So for most general playing, you'll find yourself kind of in the middle here. If I'm playing just any old stuff, this works for most playing. Anything that I'm doing kind of fits within that middle range. That gives me a good tone without adjusting anything on my bass or anything on my amp, and that works for a lot of applications. So let's talk about a few specifics. First and foremost, what I mentioned, if we want to swing, if we want to sound like an upright bass, how do we do that on electric bass? Well, there's two techniques that I'm going to show you today. The first one is just literally moving this right hand from being in the center here and pulling it towards the neck like I talked about. Now, this is very specific to only a couple styles of music and you won't use this all the time, but you're going to notice how your sound changes. So I'm just going to play one note here and I'm going to move my right hand towards the neck. I want you to listen to hear the difference in sound as I move from here to here. Now my tone gets a little bit smoother, I get a little bit more bass tone, but it also has kind of like a necky vibe to it. Like when you're playing upright bass, there's a little bit of a, almost more, I wouldn't say nasal, but you can almost feel the neck, you can hear the neck in the sound, and that's kind of what we want when we're doing that. So if I'm playing something like some Mingus, I get a little bit closer to getting that upright bass sound by adjusting it, versus if I were playing on the opposite end. It sounds good, but it doesn't sound like an upright bass. So the next way that you can adjust to kind of sound like an upright bass again is by doing a thing called palm muting. So I would literally put my palm to mute the strings, and I'm going to pluck with either my thumb or my finger to make the sound happen. So I can walk a bass line using this palm muting technique, and you get a different sound, but it's similar in the same vein. So that's basically how it works. To note that the higher you go, you want a little less pressure on the string. So if I'm up at my G string, I want a little less pressure. If I'm down at my lower strings, I want a little bit more pressure. And again, you can either use your thumb or your finger. I tend to use my pointer finger, but the traditional way is to use your thumb. It gives you a nice fat meat to the sound. This can also be used if you're playing something like reggae. You can do the same thing. So it gives you that same kind of tone sensibility. And you can also do the same thing if I'm playing reggae up here. or move it back to the palm mute. So just within the changing my placement here versus palm muting back here versus playing in the middle, I get 3 very different sounds. So the next thing I want to talk about is finger funk. So what is finger funk? If you're playing anything that's like a tower power piece, and you want to have that articulation, that strong articulation and drive to the sound, but still have a little bit of bass tone in there, but be characteristic to kind of that jazz fusion era. So ultimately getting that sound like Jaco Pastorius. Now, for me, on this specific bass, what I would do, and for most basses, you want to bring your right hand all the way back here, where you get a lot more articulation. So if I'm playing something like the chicken or something like that, playing it here is going to sound way different than if I play it here. I lose my articulation if I get up here. And I still don't have as much articulation if I'm playing here as well. I have a lot more though if I pull it back. Also, depending on where I play in the range, I could play a B flat here, I could play it here, I could play in a lot of different areas. Depending on where I play it, it would change the tone as well. I'm going to get a real bright tone if I play it all the way towards the head of the bass. And if I move over here, the tone's going to get a little bit warmer. Now the last couple techniques I'm going to talk about are not as widely used. Most of the things really have to do with just the basic technique here, moving your hand a little bit more towards the neck or moving it a little bit more towards the bridge. That covers most of the stuff you're going to do as a bass player, and the palm muting technique. Outside of that, there is slap. So the idea is a thump and a pluck for most things. In your lower strings, you would get this thump. In the upper strings, you have a pluck. Right? And that's basically the premise for slap technique. You can get a little bit more intricate with different hammer-ons. But for most things, would be the difference between that thumb and that pluck. And there's a lot of great videos online that you can see where people will break down that technique in that slap style. There's other things as well. There's tapping on the bass. But again, a lot of this stuff, like the tapping and the slap, is not as widely used in the music, especially the tapping. There's chords as well. But as a bass player, most of the things you're going to do revolve around just supporting the ensemble. The goal as being a bass player is playing the supporting role. You want to make everybody else sound good. So if you go in there and you're playing a bunch of fast stuff, you're playing a bunch of licks, you're playing a bunch of chords, you're going to get in the way of other musicians. And ultimately, you are the supporting role. People don't hire bass players because they have the most chops. People hire bass players because they're dependable, they have a great tone, they have a great sensibility, great articulation, and they know how to fit within an ensemble. So I hope this video was a great help for you guys. And if you want more content like this, feel free to go check out my YouTube channel, Tuba Visionary. You can also catch me on Instagram, social media, all that Tuba Visionary.